Thank you very much, Lucia and everybody, and thanks for the invitation. I'm delighted to be talking to you today. I'm going to talk about cultural evolution and demography, and in particular, the cultural evolution of reproduction itself. In evolutionary anthropology, generally speaking, we want to understand social and cultural dynamics in the past that often we can never observe, or things that we have only partial evidence about. And so we rely a lot on narrative, on storytelling, to motivate as well as to make sense of our research. So like this artist's impression here of hunter-gatherer family life in the late Mesolithic, we see the representation of primitive dwellings, large animals caught through cooperative hunting, the manufacture of stone tools, the presence of commensal animals, the cooperative rearing of children, the gender division of labor, all of which is based on partial and often contested archaeological evidence. Now, I want to ask, what gets left out of these stories when we use concepts that naturalize some elements of the behavior in this picture, and in particular, I'm thinking about reproductive behavior, but allows other elements of this behavior to be culturally evolving? So as you know, there's been an explosion of interest in the effects of human demography on culture, and in particular, how macro level features like population size, density, age structure, and connectivity have affected the cultural evolution, the evolution of linguistic and cultural traits in the past. And most of that research is focused on one direction of this relationship, which goes from macro level demography to culture, and not typically the other way around. So pick any model in the broader population sciences, in genetics and demography, and the assumptions about the micro foundations of demographic growth are usually quite ecologically deterministic. So basically the idea is more resources equals more people. And when you look at human population growth in the longest possible term, it certainly looks like the basic resources are really the only thing that matter for human fertility. So in the Neolithic, we see the transition from a fluctuating equilibrium of low fertility and mortality to one of high fertility and mortality, which we associate with the transition to farming in the last 10,000 years. And then we see the inverse of this process in the contemporary demographic transition, again associated with profound social and economic changes starting in Europe before the Industrial Revolution. And there's a revealing mismatch between how these two transitions get described in terms of the individual behavior that generates them, so specifically a psychological difference. Jean-Pierre Bocquet-Appel describes the difference in this way. He says that the difference between the two transitions is that the cause of the Neolithic one was unconscious, determined by the mechanical effect on maternal energetics of the invention of agriculture, while the essential cause of the contemporary transition was conscious, the will to control reproduction. But there's a clear narrative here that goes from ecological and physical determinism in the past, where there's no consciousness about or control over reproduction, to modern autonomy and conscious choice in the present. And the MMI research program is to draw attention to problems with distinctions like this when it comes to reproductive behavior, and to advocate for a much broader cultural evolutionary understanding of the micro foundations of demography in the past as well as in the present. Because what can look like stasis at one level of analysis actually looks very different often at other levels. So looking across these different scales here, our models tend to assume demographic uniformitarianism, which is that demographic mechanisms are the same, no matter what level you examine them at. So we make assumptions about birth and death rates, sometimes age structure, things that we assume to be universal to help us move between these different scales. However, the data that we have is often at different levels, and it's hard to make inferences from them at other levels. So sometimes we have archaeological and genetic data at the regional scale here, but most of the social science or anthropological or demographic data that informs our inferences, especially our models, is drawn from micro level and even finer grained spatial and temporal scales. So if we assume demographic uniformitarianism, we should be able to move smoothly between these levels of analysis. But the point I want to make here is that even patterns that might look like, say, basic Malthusian dynamics are rarely quite so simple when you're talking about the behavior of individuals living under those particular conditions. So here we can see estimates of population densities based on radiocarbon dates in different regions of Neolithic Europe. In red and light blue are the statistically significant deviations from the null model of exponential growth, with blue arrows indicating the first evidence for agriculture in each of these regions. Now, in every case, agriculture is associated with booms followed by crashes and recoveries. But in every case, those changes aren't associated with regional climate change. And that means that these processes that generate these population dynamics are probably endogenous. They're not strictly ecologically determined. And cultural evolution teaches us to assume that ecological responses themselves are mediated by culture. But the socio-cultural processes that underlie these dynamics still remain unclear. Now, certainly the way that the human life history is organized looks very much like it's adapted to deal with environmental variability. In comparison to the other great apes, human females reach menarche later and also start reproducing later. But humans tend to have shorter interbirth intervals compared to the other great apes, which means they can wean their children early, which means they can reproduce more over the course of their lifespans. And so because all human females obviously undergo menopause, but can still have a long post-reproductive lifespan, they can also contribute, which isn't typical among great apes who tend to die soon after menopause. So human females are able to squeeze more reproduction into a shorter period of time. And that's the difference between the replacement levels of fertility we see in the other great apes and the huge capacity for growth in humans. But the interesting thing here is that there don't seem to be major differences in the physiological mechanisms that allow for higher reproductive rates in humans. Instead, the differences are basically social ones. So the idea that humans pool their energy budgets across multiple individuals as they navigate the allocations of energy to competing demands of reproduction, growth, senescence, and parental investment. And this pro-social system called cooperative breeding involves enlisting the help of other people to manage the challenges of raising multiple children with long dependent periods. And that allows women to manipulate the length of interbirth intervals and increase their output. So Sarah Hrdy's argued that this social organization itself is what underlies the demographic success of our species. So this idea that it takes a village to raise a child is really baked into the way that humans reproduce. And now there's a growing empirical literature drawing mainly on human behavioral ecology, which looks at how the presence or absence of different primary kin are associated with fertility and mortality. And while all of these arguments are about the social context of reproduction, it really wouldn't be fair to call this a cultural model, because ultimately the assumption that humans are cooperative breeders comes from this cross-species comparison and not from an assessment of the cross-cultural variation itself. And that's what I really want to emphasize here. It's because this elaboration of reproductive culture is what's really crucial for humans, because of course people marry and reproduce according to their own rules. So I'll give you a really simple example from the field of kinship studies. You might know that in 1839, Charles Darwin married Emma Wedgwood, who was his first cousin. And like many gentlemen of his time, finding a spouse amongst your cousins was a conscious strategy, an important family concern. Now in the West, we tend to organize our families into this familiar kind of genealogy. But these kinship terms here, they're not just labels, they're not just linguistic terms. They actually structure people's roles and responsibilities. And in this case, who you can marry. What you might not know is that about 11% of the world's societies organize their families in this way. But because this particular structure happens to map on to how we calculate genetic relatedness, it's very easy to slip into thinking that it's a template for all of humanity. But that isn't the case. Kinship structures populations in very diverse ways around the world, often in ways that have little to do with genetic relatedness. So if Darwin had been born in Hawaii instead of 19th century Britain, Emma would have been classified as his sister, making their marriage impossible. And if he'd been born in parts of the Americas, she would have been classified as his mother, even though the underlying genetic relationships are exactly the same. This is a classic example of how culture influences marriage patterns and in turn, biological reproduction and its genetic consequences, things that we can observe today and increasingly in the past, for example, using ancient DNA. Now, cultural evolution is really interested in the basic organizing principles of human social life and how they culturally evolve. And we don't tend to assume that before the Neolithic, there were no kinship relations or networks of exchange that were guided by language and culture, but we do tend to assume for some reason that the reproductive outcomes of those features are somehow not similarly guided by complex worldviews. And that brings me to the take-home message really of the talk, which is that studying the causal effects of demography on cultural processes is only one half of this co-evolutionary picture. Demographic features themselves are also the outcome of social and cultural processes at smaller scales of analysis. And I want to convince you that we need to understand them much better if we're going to understand the role of demography in cultural evolution. So let me give you a few quick examples of how varied different cultural mechanisms can be around the world and how they can generate macro-level demographic patterns. For women in the Gambia, your age isn't determined by how many years you've been alive. It's determined by how much reproductive activity you've experienced. And you move between different indigenously defined age categories depending on how you curate your reproductive career. For example, by spacing your births and wasting less of the reproductive energy that God has determined for you. So when modern contraceptives were introduced here, it allowed women actually to more tightly control their spacing strategies, which actually led to higher fertility than the family planning interventions had anticipated. And I'm going to come back to this example a bit later in the talk. In Indonesia and Papua, the Marindanim had a practice called Otot Bombari, in which women had ritualized sexual intercourse with up to 10 men of their husband's clan on the night of their marriage, or on their return to village life after childbirth. Now, while intended to promote fertility, this actually led to widespread sterility once sexually transmitted diseases were introduced. And as a result, between 10 and 25% of the population at any time was made up of kidnapped and adopted children from other groups as part of a rich cosmology of expansionary headhunting. In China and many other places, cultural preferences for sons over daughters have led to sex-selective infanticide and abortion, generating extremely skewed sex ratios and a staggering estimate of up to 50 million so-called missing women in China alone. In Germany and many other countries, what we might call cultures of childlessness are developing that downvalue biological reproduction. And that's leading to rapid population aging, with about 40% of Germans expected to be over the age of 60 by the middle of the century. Do people really make decisions about reproduction in the same way in these different cultural environments? How do enculturated reproductive decisions actually generate macro-level demographic patterns? How can we take indigenous categories and concepts more seriously when we study them? And how do population level changes affect how these kinds of cultural mechanisms themselves are changing over time? It's really important that we start to understand this for many reasons. But one of the most important right now is because we're in the middle of one of the most important demographic shifts in human history since the Neolithic. People from radically different cultures are voluntarily converging on a below replacement or a replacement family size. And demographers are expecting a global transition to low fertility by the end of this century. And we need to be able to explain how this apparently global social norm is evolving and whether it can last, because no other animal that we know of has responded to a systematic reduction in mortality and an increase in resources by reducing rather than increasing fertility. But the issue, of course, is how to reconcile the huge variation in the mechanisms that drive reproduction, like the ones I've just shown you, with the emergence of a global pattern like this. And this comes back to this question of different scales of analysis. The demographic transition raises profound questions about how evolutionary researchers think about human reproduction. So a few years ago, I wrote a comprehensive review of the theoretical claims in the evolutionary literature, and I found there's at least 12 different evolutionary hypotheses for fertility decline, each of which gives a partial explanation at different stages of the transition. This literature has a problem with equifinality in that we haven't articulated the mechanisms that drive reproduction in a way that really provides mutually exclusive hypotheses for us to test. Models tend to use different mechanisms and assumptions depending on whether they're based on high or low fertility populations. And the conceptual implications about how evolutionary processes work in human populations and over what timescales actually differ radically depending on the model that you use. So one of the most important explanations for fertility decline is the quality-quantity trade-off. High fertility societies are assumed to be those where people invest very little in a large number of children, whereas the demographic transition is supposed to usher in a multi-generational quantity-quality trade-off motivated by human capital investment. So there's supposed to be a sweet spot, effectively, of reproductive output that would maximize fitness in the next generation. So that's the top left plot here. You see this expected distribution, this expected optimum of number of children. But the problem is that there isn't actually any empirical evidence of a long-term fitness advantage to reducing fertility. So that's what you see on the top right, is the actual distribution of how many children people have over multiple generations. Basically, the more children you have, the more grandchildren you have, etc. And if you look at the bottom plots, these are across multiple generations, you basically see the same empirical pattern repeated. What's additionally interesting here, if you look at the last plot on the bottom right, is that when we get reproductive stratification by socioeconomic status, which is what you're seeing here in these two different lines or different socioeconomic strata, what you see is that some lines are reproducing earlier and more than late reproducing lineages. And over time, what's happening is they're shortening the generation time, which is actually a really powerful reminder that the underlying units of demographic change themselves are not biologically determined, but are dynamic and co-evolving with, the economic and cultural system in which reproduction is taking place. Another argument about the demographic transition is that effective contraception tends to sever the connection between sex and reproduction. And so contraception is the reason that we have fertility decline. Now, we know this isn't a good explanation because the transition process began long before the invention of modern contraception. So we know it's not simply a question of technological innovation. So here you see a plot with numerous low fertility societies that have, very, very low fertility rates, but also have very low modern contraceptive prevalence rates. So it's perfectly possible for birth control to happen in the absence of so-called modern methods of contraception. And in any case, we know that ancient populations clearly were able to distinguish between contraception and abortifacients. So this is just a collection of purported contraceptives from across the ages, and there's a vast range of interventions that people have developed to influence their fertility. So we've got everything here from crocodile dung pessaries in ancient Egypt and sheepskin condoms in the Middle Ages to a necklace of rabbits' anuses in the middle here, which presumably just made actual contraception unnecessary, probably prevented sex. But the point I want to make here is that it's the motivation to do something about reproduction that's important and not the method per se. And if the motivation is not new, that's the thing that we want to understand if we're developing causal models of reproductive behavior in the past. Now, to the extent that culture is used in demography and evolutionary anthropology, it's best summed up by the anthropologist Eugene Hamel, who wrote about this more than 30 years ago. He said that the use of culture in demography is mired in structural functional concepts that are about 40 years old, hardening rapidly and showing every sign of fossilization. So he argued that the study of demographic behavior has actually been hampered by the widespread use of culture in different inappropriate guises, and he advocated for a much greater use of fine-grained studies and ethnography. So I agree with Hamel, and I think that the main roadblock that we need to get out of the way is this concept of natural fertility. So here's the definition. Natural fertility is fertility that exists or has existed in the absence of deliberate birth control. The factors affecting it are not solely physiological. Social factors can also play a part, sexual taboos, for example. And control of fertility can be said to exist when the behavior of a couple is bound to the number of children already born and is modified when that number reaches the maximum the couple doesn't want to exceed. This definition includes cultural mechanisms in the definition of something that's supposed to be naturalized. So on this standard definition, reproductive control only exists if you have numerical preferences and if you use modern contraception to reach them. And the important thing here is that this idea turns less on biological versus cultural determinants, and more on the idea of passive versus deliberative, i.e. conscious reproductive strategizing. And in that sense, it's identical to the quote at the beginning. Now, I think that naturalizing some people's fertility and not others is dubious for a number of reasons, because in reality, there's no such thing as a natural state of fertility. But naturalizing in the way we do lets us slip into thinking that high fertility is somehow unregulated, whereas low fertility is the result of conscious decision-making. That creates very problematic dichotomies between so-called traditional and modern populations based on the number of children they have, when instead fertility is a spectrum of diversity. It's dubious because it creates a biased narrative about human reproductive consciousness in the past, before the demographic transition. And it's politically dubious to think that reproduction is a private, domestic activity generally limited to women, when in fact, how, when, and where people reproduce is often at the core of political and social life. So thinking about natural fertility limits our theorizing because it makes the cultural influences on reproduction invisible. It's important to remember that natural fertility isn't synonymous necessarily with high fertility. So on the left, I'm showing you plots distributions of total fertility rates for agriculturalists in black and non-agriculturalists in the non-black bars. And these are all natural, so-called natural fertility societies. And you can see that there's very substantial overlap in the distributions of total fertility among farmers and foragers and horticulturalists. So you can't use a high or low fertility cutoff to make a decision about a subsistence strategy, for example. On the right, though, I'm showing you a plot where you can see that natural fertility is also often socially constructed. So this plot shows you distributions of interbirth intervals in 3 different historical populations, which are the bottom 3 lines, and 2 populations in the top lines from African populations who reported using either modern contraceptives or not. Now, the difference between the top 2 and the bottom ones is explained by cultural differences in marriage patterns, which affect the first interbirth interval. But more importantly, the top 2 are practically indistinguishable from each other. And the point about that is that we can't make inferences about reproductive intentions or action just from population level data. It's not enough to use aggregated patterns to infer reproductive strategies. This lack of understanding has major political implications because it can lead to sensational claims about the future of the human population. So, for example, the population bomb argued that hundreds of millions of people would starve to death in the 1970s and led to fundamentally unethical proposals, from forced sterilization to taxation on large families to the withholding of development aid to high fertility countries. These predictions were completely wrong, and not for the first time. Malthus also prophesied mass immiseration, but it's because we simply don't know enough about why people reproduce the way we do. And as I've already said, reproduction isn't a politically neutral domain of life anywhere. Focusing only on food production and naturalized models is a convenient way to avoid dealing with the massive structural and political inequalities that contribute to population issues, things like the disproportionate effects of climate change and the lack of reproductive justice in many areas of the world. So governments all over the world use reproductive policy to achieve reductions in fertility among undesired populations and increase fertility among desired areas of the population. And there's no reason to expect that the past was any less complicated. Okay, final issue. Some of the populations I mentioned earlier, so the Gambia and the Marandanim, they would count as natural fertility populations, but the other 2 populations wouldn't. And it's not clear why we can only include some social features that influence reproduction and not others under this definition. And remember, the distinction here is about deliberative decision-making. The implication is that the groups on the left here are deliberating less about their reproduction. And so I think this is a dangerous space for racialized and other biases to creep into these distinctions, which is another reason I don't think it's very helpful. So I want to suggest how I think we should tackle these issues as an interdisciplinary field. It seems to me there's 3 high-level challenges for us to collectively work towards. The first is that I don't think we can assume demographic uniformitarianism a priori. The second is I think we need to figure out ways to scale between different observational levels. And third, we really need more high-resolution data to build those models in the first place. So just on the first point, we can't just plug in universal models of demography. We need to start taking indigenous definitions of demographic characteristics seriously to understand how reproduction in those contexts is constrained. So I'm coming back to the example in the Gambia, and I want to give you an example based on the work of Caroline Bledsoe, who's an anthropological demographer of the region. So as I mentioned, for women in the Gambia, your age isn't based on how many years you've been alive, but on how much reproductive activity you've experienced. And you move between different indigenously defined age categories, depending on how you curate your reproductive career. So here are the age concepts in the Gambia, and their associated biological age ranges. So just focused on the pink highlighted ones here in the middle. And note that they span the entire reproductive age range. So which one of these 2 you fall into depends on the effects of births, miscarriages, losses, insufficient recoveries after childbirth, events that use up a limited amount of units of energy called muscles that a woman has. Now, becoming Serifo means that you retire from reproductive life, but that can be anywhere between the age of 29 and 47, and that can be caused by stochastic events in your life. Now, ethnography is the only way to get this kind of information, to understand that reproduction is regulated by these categories and identities in this place and time. But we also need quantitative data to know if these indigenous categories themselves actually structure demographic characteristics. So Bledsoe asked women, how many more children do you want? And if we just focus on the women who answered none in black here, we see on the left a biological age distribution of these answers, which gives us a linear picture of an increasing desire to stop reproducing. But on the right are the same data organized using the indigenous categories. And now it looks more like a threshold or a step function. What matters is if a woman is serifo or not. Now, this isn't just culture as description, it's culture as causality. And the causal logic of reproductive decision-making in this place is what moves women between these different categories, and that can affect the demography. So on to question 2, which I think is easier to answer in principle, how do we scale between these different observational levels? And it won't surprise anyone here that I think we need modeling to help us move between the levels of analysis. So sticking with the same example, I want to give you an example of building a generative simulation model of this phenomenon. And this is work by Tom Holding, who is a postdoc in my research group. So what we do here is we define rules about how many reproductive units will move a simulated individual into a new age category, and how much birth spacing and baseline fertility rates are going to be modified in each of these categories. Now, getting to this point is actually the core of the work. This is the hardest part because we've got to decide what essential characteristics to simplify from our thick descriptions. And the next step then is to simulate the population level outcomes. So here I'm showing you birth and death rates over time and population pyramids for 2 different scenarios. On the left is a model of natural population growth based purely on biological age, growing rapidly. And on the right is a model that it also incorporates this cultural age structure that I've been talking about. And here the growth is slower. So what's happening? Why is the growth slower here? Well, it's happening because women move into the serifo age group, which is the yellow line here, once they've used up all their muscles, which removes them from the general reproductive pool. Okay, imagine now that we add a family planning intervention that makes contraceptives freely available. Now, in the baseline model, contraceptives decrease the growth rate, which is what we would expect. But on the right, contraceptives actually increase the growth rate slightly. And that's not what we expect, but it's actually what happened in real world Gambia. Now, the reason it happens is, again, our cultural mechanism. With contraception, women waste fewer muscles, they efficiently space their births, and they have more live births overall. They move into the serifo category later at a lower rate, keeping them in the reproductive pool for longer. Now, I think this is really cool because it shows us that policy interventions are interventions on cultural systems and not just baseline biology. It shows us why interventions that don't take culture into account can have unintended consequences. And it gives us insights into how interventions can change the cultural features themselves. So if fewer people end up becoming serifo over time because of this, maybe the category itself will become less culturally salient. This is precisely the kind of process that cultural evolution wants to understand. So this isn't about building the perfect model. This is about taking indigenous categories seriously and translating them into a form that lets us explore if and how they modify already well understood processes. So we can borrow lots of tools from demography to do this, and I think that will really transform the precision of cultural evolution hypotheses. But clearly, I hope you can see that we have to know the ethnography first to build the model in the first place. And I just want to point out that this is part of a broader project that we're developing in Leipzig in the research group with Adam Powell and Richard McElreath, where we're trying to build an agent-based modeling environment specifically for this kind of task. So on to the third part, which is high resolution data that I think we need to build those models. In the last 15 years, I've developed 2 long-term field sites in Poland and Vanuatu, which are at 2 ends of the scale in terms of ethno-linguistic diversity. In Poland, I've been comparing different reproductive mechanisms across high fertility communities without the confounds of ethno-linguistic variation. And in Vanuatu, on the other hand, I'm exploring maximal variation in cultures of reproduction and how they influence community demography. So I'm just going to tell you about Poland first. So why are Polish dynamics really interesting? Look at the top 2 plots. Poland has one of the lowest fertility rates in the world, with a below replacement total fertility rate of 1.2 when I collected the data. But in the plot on the right, from the communities I worked with, you can see that they have high completed fertility, around 4 children per family. And that reflects a broad divide between rural and urban areas and between parts of Poland that were historically partitioned. On the bottom left, you can see this example of what's called cultural legacy. So these are voting patterns from the 2010 presidential election with the historical boundaries of different 18th and 19th century empires laid on top. So Poland was partitioned repeatedly between the Prussian, Russian, and Austro-Hungarian empires. And my field projects in the rural area of the former Austro-Hungarian area. The politics of reproduction are extremely polarized in Poland, and reproductive rights are really extremely fraught still, with the largest protests since the 80s happening just in the last year over access to abortion rights. So it was in this context that I wanted to understand fertility decline in a rural, highly religious area, and I wanted to just avoid just thinking about culture as a simple classifier and get closer to the mechanisms themselves that drive fertility decline. And that's why I wanted to focus on this largely homogeneous population and look at micro-scale variations in reproductive behavior. And that meant thinking and designing this project in multi-level terms and comparing multiple communities. So the message of the work that I'm going to summarize is that explaining reproductive behavior requires that we measure and analyze features above and beyond the individual level. So in a paper from 2014, we were interested in learning about how community level education might accelerate the cultural evolution of fertility decline. So here I'm showing you plots of predicted probabilities from a multi-level model where a woman's number of births is the outcome. And what you're seeing is differences across communities. So plot A shows you that average fertility is going down as average education goes up. So women are having half the number of children in the most educated compared to the least educated communities. And in plot B, you see that variation itself in fertility also goes down as average education goes up. And that makes sense. If everybody's getting educated, then the variation will go down. Now, we'd expect to say the same pattern in plot C, which is looking at variation in fertility against variation in education in the community. Because if everybody is converging on low fertility at the same time that they're converging on high education, then we'd expect to see exactly the same pattern as in the other two, but we don't. We see something different here. And that means that something else is driving this convergence on low fertility, independent of individual characteristics. What we found is that less educated women are reducing their fertility in the presence of higher educated women. But this also tended to mean that they had more educated friends outside their community as well as inside. So this is potentially evidence for converging values based on social learning, either via horizontal transmission between communities or via prestige and success biases within them. A second paper in 2015 looked at influences on contraceptive use in this population. So we divided contraceptives, 15 different types of contraceptive methods, into artificial methods, which are closely approximating what we might call modern methods, and any other method. So artificial methods are much more taboo. And what we wanted to see was, what's your probability of using a particular method depending on what other people are doing? And what we see here is that there's very strong social clustering when it comes to contraception. So the more women in your ego network that used a particular method, the more likely you were to use that method as well. And we thought this was possible evidence for frequency dependence in this diffusion. We also found that women are successfully reducing fertility, stopping their reproduction early and shortening their reproductive spans, mainly using natural methods, which are much less taboo in this context. We also found that the more taboo methods themselves were associated with levels of religiosity in the community. So even if you yourself were not religious, if other women in your community were highly religious, you were less likely to use them. Whereas this wasn't found for natural methods, which indicates a possible role for conformity in slowing down the spread of artificial methods of contraception. So this is about learning in private social spaces. And thirdly, we looked at another paper from 2015 at how wealth and status dynamics are changing during this transition period. So we know that there's a broadly positive association between wealth, status, and fertility that tends to reverse. and also that wealth inequalities tend to increase and then temporarily decrease as fertility declines in the course of market integration. And all of this is happening simultaneously. So the point here is that just pulling out a single predictor like women's education is only going to tell you so much about the mechanisms that in this place are driving fertility down. So I want to tell you in a bit more detail about a more recent paper, which was looking at how the structure of women's social support networks are changing in the course of extensive market integration. So I have data on up to 5 eco-network partners for each of the 2,000 women that we interviewed as part of this project. And we know how they're all related to each other. We found that the density of these networks is high. So on average, 80% of possible connections are present given the size of the network. And here I developed a new measure of kin density, which counts the proportion of ties between people that are actually kinship ties, instead of just counting the number of nodes that are kin. So this distinction is important because they're not the same thing. If women add, for example, their husband's kin to their social networks after marriage, which is very common, the kin density itself might actually decline, even though the proportion of kin in the network doesn't. And that matters because there's a lot of evidence from the cooperative breeding literature that women's and men's kin might have different effects on reproduction. There's also a general idea that the more kin in your social support group per se, the more compounded the influence of kin on reproduction will be. So we found that 38% of possible connections are actually kinship connections, given the size of the network. But we also found that looking across communities, kin density is lower in households and communities that are more market integrated, even though overall density and size isn't. So again, there's a multi-level point here, which is that independent of your own household's market integration, the integration of other people in your community somehow affects the loosening of your kin ties. And this isn't due to a lack of kin demographically speaking, or a range of other compositional features. What it implies is that some elements of microstructure of social interactions are changing during this transition period. And this is just one mechanism at one level of aggregation that's consistent with a loosening of those kinship connections over time. And while that doesn't mean that cooperative breeding isn't still happening, it does have implications for how resources and information is flowing between individuals. So by way of a summary of this work, I just want to point out that once you start digging into these questions, there's a lot of complexity to deal with. So we have individual, community, and network characteristics, all of which matter for understanding demography. Cultural evolution needs to build on these kinds of foundations, in addition to the foundational analogies with population genetics. Demographic data probably need to come before the models are developed. So the success of any modeling framework will depend on the underlying assumptions in those models, and those will rely on us providing this kind of detailed knowledge. And ultimately what it means is that we need multi-level theory as well as data. We're currently expanding this project to digitize massive amounts of historical data going back to before the Industrial Revolution. So we're hoping to be able to examine longer-term demographic trajectories of the peasant farming communities across this region in collaboration with local church authorities. Okay, I want to tell you a bit about my project in Vanuatu now. So I've been working in Vanuatu since 2015. It's an archipelago of 80 plus islands, population of about 300,000 people. It was a joint colony of Britain and France until 1980. And Vanuatu is famous for being extremely culturally and linguistically diverse. It's the most linguistically dense place per capita in the world, with 138 Austronesian languages at the last count. And all of the work that I do in Vanuatu is done in close partnership with the Vanuatu Cultural Center and its network of Indigenous field researchers. And so here I just acknowledge some of the people who have helped to make this work possible. So the backdrop to the extreme diversity that we see today in Vanuatu is a very complex demographic history, which is short and involved multiple waves of migration that brought groups with very different genetic, cultural, and linguistic ancestries into networks of contact. So it wasn't until around 3,000 years ago that the first people crossed the boundary between what's called near and remote Oceania to reach Vanuatu. And that was part of the broader population expansion that carried the Austronesian language family out into remote Oceania. Now, in 2018, we published a study that used a combination of ancient and contemporary DNA collected as part of my field project, which showed that shortly after initial settlement, there was a process of genetic population replacement that took place over about 1,000 years, with different peoples coming in from near Oceania. And the plot on the right here shows you the genetic composition of the population through time and the proportion of ancestry from so-called Austronesian sources. A contemporary New Vanuatu carry very high levels of ancestry from near Oceania, and the picture is getting more complicated all the time. And the best fitting demographic models of this process are horribly complicated, much, much more so than a simple wave of replacement. And they involve multiple admixture events in the past. And it's a bit of a paradox because the Austronesian languages are still spoken in Vanuatu today exclusively, whereas the incoming populations may have been associated with different language families in near Oceania. So we argued that the ancestor of the current languages of Vanuatu may have been used as a lingua franca by the incoming populations. And this speaks very strongly to the idea that there was ongoing contact between different groups. The archaeology of Vanuatu shows evidence of extensive trade routes and interaction spheres within the archipelago. There are also macro-cultural features that are very similar across areas, large areas of Melanesia, so things like pig exchange economies, political systems and kinship systems, all of which have important implications for the organization of reproduction in a way that explodes the complexities that you have to think about when you're trying to infer demographic phenomena. This diversity means that we can't assume demographic uniformitarianism even within a single country, as we did in Poland. It's just the opposite end of the spectrum. And part of my ongoing work here is to understand how demographic and social processes generated this diversity, and also how they contribute to maintaining or eroding it in the present day. So the project I've been developing is a high diversity complement to the Polish project. And so I collect comparable information, but also work in lots of interdisciplinary projects because there's just so many aspects to these questions. And a huge part of my work here is ethnography. So the people that I work most closely with are the Big Nambas people of Northwest Malekula, which is the second largest island in the archipelago. The Big Nambas are the largest single ethno-linguistic group on Malekula. They have a long history of expansion and a complex political system that combines elements of egalitarianism and strict hierarchy with a clan-based structure. They also have an explicit ideology of lineage growth. So what looks like natural fertility from the outside is actually, in fact, highly regulated and organized. Now, it's really important not to treat indigenous reproductive dynamics as if they're somehow homeostatic or stuck in prehistory. The damage that natural fertility does is to relegate some communities to being called pre-modern or somehow unconscious of their own reproductive politics. The reality is that reproductive dynamics are always responding to current events in a particular place and time. So a major part of my Vanuatu work is studying the impact of history, of colonialism, and today's rapidly changing post-colonial context. And my fieldwork is focused really on 3 sets of cohorts that capture many of these changes. So if you go 2 to 3 generations back, you have very strong customary traditions and indigenous language use. You have a rejection of Christianity, and you actually have relatively low fertility because in the pre-Christian past, men and women didn't live together. You go 1 to 2 generations back and you have the erosion and revival of customary traditions and languages. But in this context, you have exclusive Christianity. And in that situation, you have rapid increases in fertility, driven partly by missionary interventions, which made men and women live in the same households. And in the current generations, we're dealing with the situation of the loss of customary knowledge and languages. We're looking at diverse denominations that have since joined, and we're looking at demographic transitions. These are just some of the examples of what you need to think about, even across cohorts here. And of course, these are just things that I would be tempted to think about as an outsider. But all of these things are, of course, also indigenously defined. So I work with a network of women involved in grassroots research to try to understand the detailed cultural mechanisms of reproduction here and how people manage their reproduction. And one of the things I'm most interested in at the moment is infertility and how that reveals social technologies of reproduction and what that tells us about indigenous attitudes. So the World Health Organization defines infertility as a disease. So it's a biological dysfunction in a specific embodied location. Now in Vanuatu, there's no assisted reproductive technology. It's not on the development agenda because these are the kinds of places where it's desired that fertility is reduced. So infertility is actually an invisible problem here and in much development research. And so it has to be reckoned with at the community level. So what happens to women who can't reproduce? Well, you might be surprised to know that often local responses to infertility include anger, a demand for physical labor, increased sharing of resources, potentially even compensation payments, and the policing of women's movements. In extreme cases, they can involve the withholding of food, information, and social contact. Now, to Westerners, these actions seem very harsh because surely more support and food sharing or the relaxation of garden labor would relieve some of the physiological constraints on conception or maybe reduce stress. Those are the kinds of things we tend to think about, but they're not that salient in the Big Nambas context because reproduction here, as in other Melanesian places, isn't really understood to be determined purely by, or even importantly by, physiological limitations. Instead, the major determinant of reproduction and the first target for correctional activity is the will and social comportment of the woman herself. So infertility isn't interpreted primarily as an inability to get physically pregnant, but as an unwillingness to do so. And it's seen, therefore, as an attempt to block the continuity of the patriline. And to understand that, we need to appreciate that reproductive activity and reproductive responsibility is distributed among the women of a patrilineal compound, with the result that the costs of infertility are borne in very complex ways by all its members. And there's important implications for thinking about reproduction in this way. And there are many cultural mechanisms that facilitate this kind of reproductive pooling. For example, the kinship terms here blur the distinctions between different women. So all the children will refer to all the in-marrying women as mother. There's a levirate marriage system, which means that women whose husband die remarry a younger brother of their dead husband, and that keeps women in the patrilineage. And it's also reflected in the fact that all the brothers refer to those in-marrying women as mother of our children, which already indicates that they may be expected to reproduce with more than one of them. Children can also be easily incorporated into the lineage through compensation payments, which means that reproduction before marriage or outside marriage occasionally can be okay because there are clear mechanisms for incorporating them into the patriline and making them literally part of that lineage. And that has implications for men's political status because if you don't have sons to carry on the lineage, you often can be sidelined in the political hierarchy. And so men's status themselves can be determined by how many sons they have, and not necessarily the other way around. In the ethnography of Vanuatu and other parts of Oceania, it's understood that the reproduction of the lineage doesn't properly belong to women in the sense that they're not entitled to a major stake in its political or social fate. But nonetheless, they're the essential conduits of the production of men. And so they wield actually enormous power via their reproductive capacities. The greatest danger they can pose is to refuse to reproduce at all. And Holly Wardlow, who's an ethnographer of the Huli in Papua New Guinea, calls this kind of refusal negative agency. And in Malekula, that's why women who don't reproduce are sometimes seen to be in active conflict with the interests of the lineage that they married into. And this sets off a whole host of social dynamics that are unexpected from a Western point of view. All these ideas have important theoretical implications. They help us develop better quantitative data collection as well as models that help us understand the causal structure of reproduction. And we can't just wave all this stuff away under the idea of natural fertility when it exists in a rich set of indigenous ideas about reproduction. So what insights come from this work? I just want to remind you that in Vanuatu, different waves of history and prehistory, as well as the colonial experience and the dynamics of diversity, have to be taken account if we're going to understand reproduction. Before we build models, we need ethnography. We need to know the system, and that takes many years. Involving local communities is critical to learning what those mechanisms are and when they're salient and important. And just to summarize, if we're going to take cultural evolution seriously, we can't relegate reproductive behavior, which is central to human social life, to either a pre-conscious state or a set of self-organizing dynamics without historical or political context. We can't assume demographic uniformitarianism a priori. Our models need to take indigenous categories seriously, and our inferential methods need salient and informative quantitative data informed by ethnography to unleash their full power. And before we build those models, we need to know our mechanisms. So this is a call to recenter ethnography. And I just want to finish on 2 points, one about the future and one about the past. Population growth projections often assume fixed reproductive parameters, but it only takes a small difference in the number of children being born, half a child more or less per woman, to have absolutely massive global effects. And so we need to understand much better what the mechanisms are that are driving those differences. But I also hope that down the road, these issues might become relevant in fields like population genetics, where researchers are wanting to infer demographic history. So all of population genetic inference, obviously, as you know, relies on the concept of effective population size, represented by the width of these branches. There are extremely strong demographic assumptions inherent in population genetics, like random mating, lack of age structure, strict generation times, and uniform reproductive rates. In reality, all of these features are going to co-evolve with cultural systems in the past, and it would be just brilliant if we could explore implications for inferring dates of divergence as well as understanding human migrations around the world using some of these insights in the future. Another big growth area is the inference directly of social organization from genetic relatedness. And as anthropologists, we know that kinship isn't genetics. So our colleagues really need our help to know how social structures potentially generate genetic ones. So I'm going to finish on that point, and thank you very, very much for your time.
Thank you, Heidi. That was absolutely fascinating, and yeah, lots to think about. So we can go into the Q&A now. There are already a couple of questions in the chat. So Walter asks, is there any evidence that climate change has made an impact on population size or sexual practices throughout the world?
That's a really cool question that I haven't thought about. I really don't know the answer to that question. It would depend on whether you're thinking about it in an archaeological context or whether you're thinking about it in the current day situation. Certainly, the effort to slow down catastrophic climate change is becoming ever more entwined with the effort to reduce populations. And that's actually always been the case. The two things have always been sort of connected. So there's this kind of secret populationism sometimes behind ecological arguments. But of course, it's a lot more complicated than that. And you know, whether climate change itself, you know, the observation of climate change influences people to, let's say, have fewer children. I guess people could argue that that happens occasionally in the richest countries in the world, where you have people who are voluntarily choosing either not to reproduce or to have fewer children than they would have had otherwise. I'm not sure that it's necessarily impacting directly reproductive decision-making in all parts of the world, but I may be wrong. This is not an area that I'm an expert in, so I don't want to give you an answer that might be misleading. I'm sure there's research out there on this, though.
Sure. Okay. So there was another question from Walter in the chat. Is there anything known about population size and practices in people who've been forced to migrate? So, for example, in refugee people.
Again, there will be research on this out there, depending on the kind of situation you're talking about. So, forced movements of people. Yeah, I mean, I don't know that there's necessarily an a priori prediction that they would have higher or lower fertility as a result of their movement, but we certainly know that, you know, frontier populations tend to have higher fertility, and that's one of the things to think about if you're ever modeling this stuff, you know, in the past, where you're not sure about the context of demography in a particular place in a particular time period. Is if you're assuming a frontier population, you may assume higher levels of reproduction. But what I would encourage people to think about is, you know, is that necessarily just because there's more resources for those people, or is it that it requires an ideology of lineage growth? You know, it requires cultural rules, cultural values, you know, that go along with that. So there's lots of things to think about. Any change that a population undergoes, whether it's movement, whether it's cultural change, whether it's economic change, institutional change, all of these things are often responded to with alterations in various different reproductive parameters, and especially in the values about reproduction. So if you just think about, you know, how we think about families, you know, in our first world, you know, worlds, they're radically different. You know, most people don't even think about having children until they're in their 30s these days, and that's just very evolutionarily novel situation.
Okay, next we have it's a comment from Jenny French in the chat. Great talk, Heidi. I don't have any specific questions, but I do want to thank you for getting me thinking about indigenous kinship categories and their influence on demography. It's one of those considerations that always vexes me when I think about kinship and demography in Paleolithic populations. I have no idea how you get at this, and envy you have the high resolution ethnographic data.
Yeah, I think this is a point. I mean, thank you, Jenny. That's really, really kind. I think this is exactly why I like trying to speak to audiences outside anthropology, because I think actually we can help with some potentially long-term, you know, my dream is that we can actually use the ethnographic record where we do have this kind of detail to build models that can allow us to make predictions. So if you're thinking about a demographic profile in the past, you might not be able to say, you might never be able to say anything about what specific kinship system or, you know, kinship ideology that reproduction occurred within. But what you might be able to say is it's consistent with a set of different organizational principles that we do know about from the ethnographic record and inconsistent with others. And so that's where I think starting from the ethnographic record, building models that we can then use to explore the dynamics and implications, and you know, opening our imaginations about what is it that can control, that can sort of determine the population level outcomes that we need to use as proxies in other disciplines to help join the dots, not only in terms of time periods or anything like that. I'm not sure that we can ever completely, you know, have perfect time transects of these things, and these things may have only evolved more recently than the kinds of time periods that archaeologists are interested in, but we can at least start to explore the possible parameter space that might be affecting different demographic regimes in the past. And that's something I'm really hopeful that in the long term can bring the anthropology and the archaeology much closer together.
That sounds awesome. I look forward to hearing more, Heidi. Thanks again for the talk.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jenny. So we have another question from Walter in the chat. I'm not sure if your research sort of covers this, but how has AIDS education been influenced by reproductive practices around the world?
Do you mean how has AIDS education been influenced by reproduction, or how has reproduction been influenced by AIDS education? I'm not sure which way you're thinking. I'm not sure. I mean, AIDS is important and has, you know, there's a lot of demography looking at the impact of AIDS and vice versa. It's not my area of expertise. So I will restrain myself from speculating in an area that I really don't have any expertise in. So I'll let you look that one up, because there's tons of research on AIDS and demography.
So we probably do have time for one more question if anybody has anything that they would like to ask, either out loud or in the chat. If not, then we can go ahead and close for today. So thank you, Heidi, so much for the great talk. It was very, very interesting and a great way to end the year. Thank you, everybody, for coming along today and for coming along to our series this year. We're going to be releasing the programme for next year next week, so make sure to look out for that. We're going to also be expanding our webinar team. So Harry, who's here today, and Dylan are also going to be joining us to organise the series. So yeah, thank you, everybody. Have a great Christmas and see you in the new year.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Goodbye.